I'm Jamie Seabold. I'm a regional sales manager here at SPS. I've been with the company for almost 10 years now.
My name is Michael Leach. I'm a certified prosthetist and orthotist. Been in the industry a really long time. Got in 1974, as many of us did. I was a gopher at a facility, and I seem to think that was an excellent career path. Clinical practice for close to 30 years, and then I moved over to the medical device manufacturer side. Spent 18 years at AOPA. 13 of those were in clinical education, technical support, taught a lot of the classes and that sort of thing, and then moved over to the R&D side and worked exclusively in their R&D center in Salt Lake City, and have joined Fillauer a little over a year ago. And my role is kind of both those hats. I'm called an R&D clinical specialist, so I support them from an educational point of view, and I also work with all the R&D groups that Fillauer has around their kind of global structure, facilitate a lot of the patient testing, and help represent the clinical aspects of product development and make sure that those are front and center, as well as how the folks that use all of our products and handle them, that they're well represented in that development process as well.
Certainly one of my favorites, and I know it's a favorite out there in the marketplace, is the AllPro. What can you tell us about the AllPro?
What excites me about the AllPro is it probably the first foot in created this class of what we're calling crossover feet now. For like this mid K3 to K4 user, and I should probably just put an example of one out there that you can see. It really checks a box. I mean, if you look at the design of this and really how it came about, Jamie, is that it was an athlete that said, I love my blade, but there's activities that I need to heal. I'm not always going straight on, flat level ground and that sort of thing. So can you make me a running blade with a heel? And that's really what the geometry of this looks like. And so it was sort of the first in this category or class of feet that came out. It's really a family of feet by themselves. So what you're seeing me hold here is a 6-inch AllPro, and there are 4 heights in the adult categories: a 6, an 8, a 10, and a 12. Pediatric side, there's a 6 and an 8. And then we have a posterior mount version of this. So we really offer quite a range of opportunities for you to dial in the specific needs for your patient. The 8-inch AllPro is probably the sweet spot. It's probably most people have room for it, and it's probably the most commonly used. The 6-inch that you see me holding here is probably used when you don't have room for an 8. When you start going into the taller sizes, the energy storage and return is really quite dynamic. That's one of the beauties of the energy storage and return qualities of this design. But when you get into a 10-inch, you're really looking at a user who's really a strong quads, for example, and they can control the long C-shaped carbon spring for it. I would say triathletes would be a good example. 12-inch, even though it's there, it's probably not commonly used, because space is not quite available. It's quite a tall foot, but it's also really dynamic. So you need someone who is really tall and who is probably more of the stature of a Paralympic athlete, if you will.
Would you say that this foot is more geared towards an athlete, or could a lower K3 patient, benefit from the AllPro as well?
I would really say it's really the weekend warrior type, someone who has desires to expand the range of things that they do that they can't do in traditional modular, say J-shaped feet that were sort of the predecessor of this category. So I would say yes, because two things are involved in controlling the dynamic energy storage and return qualities of this foot. One is strong quads, and the other is the length of residual limb. You have a long lever arm. When you look at the studies on crossover feet, you're really finding that the ability to have the strength in the lever arm is a big factor in the success. Folks that have those two features, one or both of those, find that they have better 6-minute walk tests, for example. They have better patient satisfaction. They have lower metabolic costs. The design of these feet really kind of lend itself to vibrant walkers. What really happens with this is that it allows you to keep the foot on the ground longer and still dorsiflex over that. So it means you're bending that carbon spring for a longer period of time, storing that energy from mid-stance to terminal stance, for example. What that gives you is a higher rate of energy return at terminal stance. And there's been great studies that were done out of the University of Washington that have demonstrated that this style of foot, in fact, AllPro, they tested like 8 different feet, and the AllPro was the most flexible of those feet, and the flexible nature of that is directly related to the energy storage and return, because this foot also had the highest degree of late stance energy return. Those are really important characteristics and help you as a clinician define the person who's going to really benefit from this. Some people, you get on an 8-inch AllPro, for example, for the first couple of weeks might feel like they're really using their quads more, sort of dissipate. And if a clinician is concerned about whether this is too much foot for someone, if they ask their patient, to do a lunge on the prosthetic side 5 times, if they can do that, then they're probably strong enough for this style of foot, if you will.
Is this a good foot for everyday use, or do you think it's more for like a weekend activities, kind of a second leg for those type of events?
Great question. That comes up a lot. No, that's the whole nature of this crossover sort of namesake, if you will. It's a foot that allows you to do everyday activities a really nice way. So it's going to walk very neatly, selected cadence. And many people want a foot that is also going to do well uneven terrain, up slopes, down slopes, and uneven ground. And so the fact that this foot is very flexible in a dorsiflexion, plantar flexion range allows for the slope accommodation really nicely. And it also allows, because it has a split toe, it also allows for the multi-axial or uneven ground compliance. The challenge for many of us as clinicians and for many users is they don't have the option to have more than one foot simultaneously. They can't get a blade, for example, and an everyday foot. And so, unfortunately, we've been pigeonholed and forced into these narrow compromises. So the beauty of this foot, and what you've probably seen in the whole industry as a whole, is that we've kind of widened the bell-shaped curve with the advancement of materials and designs and technology. So that not only do these products perform really well for my 80%, which is, my accountant's job. I come in, I sit at a desk, I walk my dog before I go to work in the morning, but also when I get home and want to go to the gym and do CrossFit or, do a weight training protocol. So these feet, broaden out that bell-shaped curve and allow people to perform really well on the edges where those edges were much narrower before.
You mentioned CrossFit, and obviously there's some lifting involved with that, right? Would a patient have to move up a category or two to accommodate the weight that they would be lifting, or how did that work with the AllPro?
It really hasn't been our experience with that. On the R&D side, you always develop things and they test things to a certain spot, right? And so you have to say this category of carbon lab has this weight range or whatever, but really we found that most people don't have issues in specific sporting activities for lifting heavy weight. Now, if that's going to be a big part of your pursuit, like for example, a strongman competition, that's sort of an extreme example, but we have ninja warriors on this foot. Actually, there was a study by Eric Nickel that was done, and if folks want these studies, they're available. Email me, and they're actually at our exhibitor hall webpage. That what Eric Nickel did was wanted to return soldiers to active duty, and they realized they had to jump off 4-foot heights for trucks, and they're carrying a lot of loaded gear, almost twice their body weight. Which feet are going to hold up from this? And so they did a drop test with this, and the AllPro was able to be dropped from the highest distance with the greatest load without failure than any other feet. So the design is super, super robust. If you really have someone who's moving into kind of that kind of extreme thing, so I would say for impact, like we've had a Ninja Warrior competitors, and we've had people who are in Cirque du Soleil doing acrobatic things like handsprings and flips. You're going to be really super fine. You might want to consider like a posterior mount AllPro then, and that's sort of the beauty of the AllPro. It has this long family options for you. So when you get into the posterior mount feet, you get into even a higher range of durability and energy storage and return. Again, much longer carbon spring to manage storing energy and to dissipate forces throughout the foot. And so we have people who are in some of our posterior mount feet that are doing strongman competitions, 700 pounds.
You mentioned posterior mount, the AllPro version, or other feet that require that. Can you talk about the setup process? Is that difficult to do? Is that something Fillauer has to fabricate in-house? What is that process like?
So we've really tried to make that as simple as possible. And if you think about how you set up a traditional distal mount foot, you bench align it on the foot. You have adjustment capabilities. You watch somebody dynamically align. You do that. You transfer it out in a traditional jig, and then you finish the prosthetic system. And so we've actually made posterior mount feet done in the exact same process. So we have an alignment fixture that you would use for all of our posterior mount feet, and it'll allow you to change height, inset, outset, ab and adduction. And so you would bench align it on that just like you typically would with this alignment fixture. You would dynamically align it and watch someone walk on it, and you would affect the similar changes that you would in the same sort of time frame for a distal mount foot. And then to capture that, we have an adaptation to our vertical alignment jig. It's a transfer fixture for that. So you can actually use the vertical alignment jig and transfer this alignment exactly, and then do a definitive lamination. And even if you wanted, as an interim step between dynamic alignment and definitive lamination, you could take out the alignment fixture and wrap it with a fiberglass casting tape and have someone go home on it for a few days just to feel really good and to reaffirm for them and for you that the alignment is exactly where it needs to be before you finish it. And then we've developed a unique 30-minute process to do a definitive lamination for it. So even though it's probably a little different than most clinicians are used to doing, because posterior mount feet are not nearly as common. Let's face it, you're cutting at the height, right? That's the one thing that might be a concern for someone. Are they going to like this foot? I got to cut, I'm going to cut at the height. But we've really made the process very similar. And again, we have video links to show people exactly how to manage all of that whole process. So people have seen the Pro Cover foot shell for that. Yep. So this is a non-traditional foot shell, and one of the nice things about it is that it comes in two halves and it slips together over the foot itself. And the beauty of this is that it's about 5 times more durable than a traditional foot shell, and it allows users to do self-maintenance. If I go to the beach and get it exposed and there's a lot of sand and dirt and grit in there, I can easily take this apart, wash it out, put it together. No Spectra sock either. So that makes life easier for folks. And many people kind of feel like it enhances the rollover characteristics of the foot. So one of the other products that we wanted to talk about people today is our Dynamic Walk carbon fiber AFO. So there's a lot of great carbon fiber off-the-shelf technology out there today, and they all have their perfect place. And one of the things that's nice about the Dynamic Walk is that it's really meant for an isolated anterior tibial compartment weakness, in other words, a drop foot. One of the benefits of this is that it's very lightweight. It is a dorsiflexion assist AFO. You can kind of see me working that. And it really allows the user that has the gastroaxillary complex or active plantar flexors to still use those. If you're using other versions of an off-the-shelf pre-preg AFO, they're either very rigid in a ground reaction style that don't let you take advantage of that plantar flexion range, or they have a posterior strut that would allow some plantar flexion, but they're resistive of that motion. They're not really as free moving in that way. This allows users to adjust a drop foot weakness to have full range of motion at the ankle. So that's really super important, not only in stance phase and to be able to control push off really well in normal walking on a flat ground, but you can see that in swing phase, its resting position is very dorsiflexed, where most of the other AFOs are very static at around 90 degrees. So this allows for a little higher toe clearance for folks to manage off-road walking, if you will, to go up the verticality of a step, or to go over a tree limb or an obstacle, or hiking in the woods, if you will. And it allows for a flexibility in the coronal and transverse planes. So if you're walking on uneven ground, it's quite adaptable for that. And there are a number of configurations. This you see is sort of a single medial and lateral upright version. You can use 2 of these on both sides if you want more dorsal assist, or you can do this as a unilateral setup with 1 spring or 2 springs. These springs are made out of a material that's called PEEK, which is polyether ethyl ketone, and it's very strong material. And the rest of the AFO is made out of a thermoformable composite, which means you can adjust it with a heat gun. Traditional pre-pregs, you could have no post-fabrication adjustability. This is very adjustable. And the 5th option for this really is that it can be custom fabricated. So that if you have someone that just, really their anatomical shape does not lend itself to more of a generic off-the-shelf configuration, then we can make this for you from a cast. for you in our central fab. We also sell CFC as a sheet material, but we don't. It would be difficult in most labs to do the connection of this in a fabrication point of view. So that would typically be handled in our central fabrication area in Chattanooga. And it allows you also to do some things trying to manage coronal or triplanar issues mild in the foot with more of a UCB style foot plate, if you will, versus this very low profile foot plate that would go in a shoe. And typically you might not think of these devices as an application with diabetics, but it is really those folks who are insensate, at-risk skin. This foot plate is very low profile and would fit underneath a diabetic insert.
From a patient perspective, we hear a lot, does it fit well in the shoe?
This is modifiable, so you can trim this. You can make it match the internal dimension of a shoe. You can kind of see that it's very low profile. It comes sized, of course, so this can be narrower or wider. And of course, you could gently heat this area here on the foot plate and open it up if you needed to create, so there was no contact with the person's skin or anatomy per se. And you can see that the way this is shaped, it really goes behind the medial and lateral malleolus. So there's typically not any anatomical insult to the bony areas of the foot. And you can see here, the navicular on the medial side is typically a hot spot, and you really wouldn't find that in this particular case. So fitting in footwear and being very thin and low profile is one of the things that this excels at.
From what I understand, the materials that go into the manufacturing of the dynamic walk are really strong. Can you talk about the materials?
It's a carbon composite, so that's what's nice about that, is that it is really strong and durable. The epoxy resin in this particular case, all carbon composite prepregs have some sort of epoxy resin or epoxy acrylic matrix that interacts with the carbon fiber. And in this particular case, it's heat formable, which is just a nice chemistry, and it's a little different than most of the prepregs that are out there. You can't modify those in the office. You can trim them away, but you can't really, modify them. So that's one of the nice parts of us. It has a strength, but it gives you as a clinician options to fine tune a product for your patient.
Now, over time, obviously, if you have to make adjustments, does it create weakness in the material?
You can heat multiple times, but of course it depends on the modification. You can certainly weaken the product. If you make sort of a spherical change, say the first metatarsal head might be problematic for someone, and my attempt to relieve that was to push this out like a dome. That doesn't mix well with carbon fiber, and that would create inherent weakness with that. So you would want to approach relieving that problem in another way, like adding a metatarsal. You can create a metatarsal pad that would offset the metatarsal here, or it's so thin that you could literally put some sort of foot orthotic over the top of that and use that as a modifiable structure to offload certain areas in that.
Now, with the struts that go into the dynamic walk, is that the same material that you use in the Nexo?
Yeah, so that's true. That is PEEK. So again, and you'll find PEEK is in many of the products in our industry. Some products and feet, it's really durable, almost indestructible in a lot of ways. Often on the R&D side, even though it's an expensive material to use, it's a material that is sometimes used where we couldn't find something that could pass fatigue testing. So like you see that in the Nexo, and thanks for bringing that up. And this was released a couple years ago. It's a kit form. This is a transhumeral system that would mount either on our E400 or our E200 elbow, but it also comes in a transradial system. And to me, it's very cool from a visual point of view. I think a lot of folks that are using orthoses or prosthesis these days are looking for something that makes a bold statement that says, how cool is this that I have it? You want to talk to me about it? I hope it catches your eye. A couple things on the user side of it that's nice. When you're using an upper limb device, you've lost tactile sensation, so you don't know, you can't feel that you've actually grasped something. And so visually being able to see the objects that you're grasping are important. That's why something like a canted hook for a terminal device is so nice, and it lets you approach small objects very nicely. So you can see through the Nexo. So that gives you a little greater range of visual acuity to work with objects that are in front of you in your working space, which is super important. And it adds some features to the user. Since it has a flexibility to it, I don't know if you can see me bending it. People ask about the durability of it. You look at it and it looks kind of, so lightweight and sleek, but it's super durable. So we've had a lot of people who work in carpentry, and with a quick disconnect wrist, they can put on something that can handle a hammer. This can take that abuse because it creates a shock absorption quality to it, and it doesn't transfer that directly to the socket or the residual limb. And it also allows for torque to happen at the end. I don't know if people can see that. So when you're handling heavy objects, those sorts of things, the shock attenuation and the torsion that it permits really is a nice creature comfort for users. For the clinicians, this sort of modular system really allows them to fine-tune the subtleties of functional use for the users. This can be shortened after the fact. If you're doing a traditional setup where you have a traditional forearm, even though those can be shortened, that's a lot more rigmarole, if you will, to go through to shorten it. You have the wrist unit to consider, those sorts of things. You can also change the flexion angle. So if someone has, you want to build a little pre-flexion into it, once you do it in a traditional setup, it's fixed and done, unless, of course, you go to a lot of work to change that. But here you could just bend the PEEK material. You don't do it with a heat gun. You bend it in your hand and you change the length of the individual rods with these connector portions of it, and you can change the flexion or extension angle to really fine tune it for someone. And the third piece about it is that it comes in a kit, and so if any of these were to fail, and we've had very few returns for failure, you can replace it in the field in a few minutes. It comes apart with a few set screws that hold it in place, and you can replace PEEK rod in no time at all.
And it looks extremely lightweight. I'm sure that's a pretty important factor for an upper extremity patient, is the weight of it too, right?
Oh yeah, and you can't see it in the transradial portion. It's actually mounted with a lamination ring, and it can be mounted as high up or as far down on the socket itself that you want. So it really takes a lot of load. When you're picking up something heavy on the end, it's quite a lever arm, and it really transfers the load much more easily than a traditional would do for them. And in a transradial, it lets you can kind of cut the distal end out, and with a flexible inner socket, which is very common, you could put a pull hole at the distal end. And so it's very easy for someone who might want a system that's down without a line, or lends itself to a lot of interesting things and configurations. Encourage people to do it. There's both a transhumeral and transradial kit for preemptively on the L coding piece. Again, we have it all drawn out. There's like 4 or 5 L codes. And of course, a lot of that is a function of, what kind of wrist unit you're using and what kind of terminal device that you're going to have on the end of it, because they all code a little bit differently. But we have these sort of laid out for folks in a neat way, and they come with a kit that's all the pieces, parts that you need are there.
That's awesome.
Thanks,
Michael. I certainly appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure having a conversation with you, learning about your products.
Appreciate the opportunity anytime. Happy to work with you.
We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.